You might have known ancient Egypt for its pyramids and ruthless pharaohs that forced people to work in harsh conditions, decided every aspect of their lives, deaths, and so much worse. However, ancient Egypt was far beyond that. The pharaohs and rulers belonged to a particular class and were not the whole of Egypt. Life in ancient Egypt. Life in ancient Egypt was thought to be perfect. Egyptians were proud of their kingdom and architecture. Egyptians always felt that they were living the best life. Hence, the pyramids were built not in the love of death, but in the afterlife. Sports, games, reading, festivals, and spending time with friends and family were just as crucial to Egyptian life as working hard at farming the land or building temples and monuments. The Egyptian world was filled with magic. Heka, or magic, existed before the gods, and was, in fact, the driving force behind the gods' actions. The best documented individuals are always the king and court because, like today, people at the time paid more attention to celebrities than to their neighbours, and the scribes who wrote the history of the time wrote about what was more interesting. However, evidence from later Greek and Roman writers, as well as letters and archaeological finds from various epochs, demonstrate that Egyptians of all social classes valued life and enjoyed it as much as possible, much like modern people do. Class distribution in ancient Egypt. The king, his vizier, the members of his court, regional governors, later referred to as nomarchs, military generals during the New Kingdom, government overseers of worksite supervisors, and the peasantry comprised Egypt's strict social classes, because it was believed that the gods had decreed the perfect social order that mirrored the gods. Social mobility was neither observed nor encouraged for most of Egypt's history. The gods had blessed people with everything, but they had chosen the king to rule them because he was the best person to know what they wanted and do it. From the pre-dynastic period across the Old Kingdom, circa 2613 to 2181 BCE, when the sun god Ra's priests started to gain more power, the king served as an intermediary between the gods and the people. But even after this, the king was still considered God's chosen messenger. Upper class. They enjoyed great wealth, status, and luxuries unimaginable to the majority of the population as the god's chosen man, the king of Egypt. Because it was the king's responsibility to rule in accordance with balance and harmony, it was believed that he deserved the luxuries in proportion to his status and the weight of his responsibilities. Inscriptions frequently boast of the large and dangerous animals a particular monarch hunted during his reign, and the king is frequently depicted hunting. But almost always, royal game wardens caught and brought elephants and lions to preserves, where the king hunted the animals while surrounded by guards who protected him. The majority of the time, the king would hunt in the open only after the area had been cleared of dangerous animals. Physicians and scribes. In ancient Egypt, scribes were highly prized because the god Thoth, who inspired and oversaw their work, saw them as a unique selection. The scribes were tasked with recording events so they could be preserved forever. The gods themselves were aware of a scribe's work, which made them immortal not only because subsequent generations would read it, but also because the gods themselves were aware of it. Like librarians in her service on earth, Seshat, patron goddess of libraries and librarians, delicately placed one's work on her shelves. The majority of scribes were men, but there were also female scribes who lived as well as their male colleagues. Dualf's Instructions, a well-known Old Kingdom piece of literature, promotes a love of books and encourages young people to pursue higher education and become scribes to live the best life possible. Although not all scribes became priests, all priests were scribes. The priests must read and write to fulfill their obligations, particularly concerning morgue ceremonies. Doctors began their training as scribes because they had to be literate to read medical texts. Physicians needed to be aware of which god, evil spirit, ghost, or other supernatural agents may be responsible for the majority of diseases, because it was believed that the gods brought them about as punishment for sin or as a lesson. They had to be able to read the religious literature of the time, which included works on dentistry, surgery, setting broken bones, and treating various illnesses, in order to do their jobs. Until later in Egypt's history, when the profession became more secular, Doctors were typically priests because there was no separation between religious practice and daily life. Military. Prior to the Middle Kingdom, the military consisted of regional militias that nomarchs conscripted for a specific purpose, typically defense, and then sent to the king. Amenemhat I, 1991 to 1962 BCE, reorganized the military at the start of the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom to create the first standing army, reducing the power and prestige of nomarches and putting the army directly under his control. Following this, the military was split between upper-class leaders and lower-class members of the rank and file. The military offered opportunities for advancement that were unaffected by social class. The Egyptian army was primarily concerned with defense prior to the New Kingdom. Still, pharaohs like Thutmose III, 1458 to 1425 BCE, and Ramesses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE, led campaigns to expand the empire beyond Egypt's borders. Egyptians avoided traveling to other countries because they feared that if they died there, it would be harder to get to the afterlife. Soldiers on foreign campaigns had a genuine concern about this belief, and plans were being made to bring the dead to Egypt to be buried. According to some accounts, there is no evidence that women would have wanted to serve in the military or served in the military. For instance, Papyrus Lansing describes life in the Egyptian army as a life of never-ending misery that ends in early death. However, it should be noted that scribes, particularly the author of the Papyrus Lansing, consistently portrayed their work as the best and most essential, and that scribes left behind the majority of military life reports. Lowest class. Peasant farmers, who were not the owners of the land on which they worked or the homes in which they lived, made up the lowest social class. The land was claimed by the ruler, individuals from the court, nomarchs or ministers. A typical expression of the labourers to begin the day was, "Let us work for the honourable." No matter what other occupation they had, the peasants were almost entirely farmers. They planted and harvested their crops, kept some for themselves, and gave the landowner the majority. Women took care of the majority's private gardens, while men worked in the fields. The goods that were traded were produced by members of the lowest social class, who also provided the means for the culture as a whole to thrive. The labour force that built Egypt's pyramids and other monuments also consisted of these peasants. When the banks of the Nile River burst, it was impossible to farm, so men and women went to work on the king's projects. This work was always paid, and there was no written or physical evidence to support the claim that any of Egypt's great structures were built by slaves. The only chance for the peasantry to move up was to work on monuments like the pyramids and their mortuary complexes, temples and obelisks. In Egypt, exceptionally skilled artists and engravers were in high demand and were paid more than unskilled labourers who merely moved the building stones from one location to another. Peasant farmers could likewise work on their status by rehearsing a specialty to give the jars, bowls, plates, and different ceramics individuals needed. Painters were required to decorate upper-class homes, palaces, tombs, and monuments, and skilled carpenters could make tables, desks, chairs, beds, and storage chests. The lower class could find an opportunity through work in metals, jewels, and sculpting. Members of the peasantry made the exquisite jewellery of ancient Egypt, consisting of gems delicately mounted in ornate settings. The majority of Egyptians were among these people, and they served in the army and, in rare cases, as scribes. However, a person's job and social standing were typically handed down to their son. Family system in ancient Egypt. The ancient world's highest birth rate was in Egypt, but things were not exactly flawless. Accidents and illnesses were unavoidable, and there was no welfare program to assist the unfortunate. Since the family was the only reliable support system, it was a very important institution. Marriage was more practical than a romantic union meant to make a viable economic unit. Everyone got married, even the gods and goddesses. A man who was not married was thought to be incomplete, so schoolboys were told to get married early and have as many children as possible. Boys were expected to learn the trades and professions from their fathers and uncles, whereas girls stayed at home and learned from their mothers. Girls would marry in their early 20s, resuming the cycle. The food and drinks Egyptians enjoyed. No one ever went hungry in Egypt because the land was so fertile. There was no money, so food was grown at home, obtained through rations, hunted, fished, or traded at the market. Wells, the Nile, and Egyptian-built irrigation canals were all sources of water. The primary source of carbohydrates was grain, such as wheat or barley. Even the gods, whose temples received daily offerings of hundreds of loaves, ate a lot of bread. The typical peasant family ate a healthy diet of bread, fish, onions, pulses, and vegetables, with occasional small game and birds. Fish and vegetables were plentiful. Meat consumption was more common among the elite. The majority of people drank beer, a thin, thick, slightly sweet beverage that was best enjoyed with a filtering straw at every meal. The elite had access to wine made from grapes grown in the Nile Delta. Clothing of the ancient Egyptians. Egyptian royalty walking through the fields or eating at a delectable banquet are depicted on numerous painted tomb walls in white, intricately pleated attire. This is a very idealized representation. According to archaeological evidence, the majority of women wore simple, sleeveless dresses, similar in style to the galabiyas worn by modern Egyptian villagers. Linen was used for making these dresses. Silk and cotton were unheard of in ancient Egypt. The ensemble was completed with a shawl and woven sandals for warmth. Men wore similar clothes, but when working in the fields they would wear a kilt instead of a long outer garment. These basic clothes would have been handy. They would have been passed down, patched, and darned until they were used as mummy wrap at the end of their useful life. Festivals in ancient Egypt. All gods' birthdays in Egypt were celebrated. Individual birthdays of kings were also observed, and events like funerals, births, and housewarmings also existed. A party or festival was held to celebrate all of these and more. Each ancient Egyptian festival had its own distinct character, depending on the nature of the occasion, but they all involved drinking and eating. Vegetables and grains, wheat, were the staples of the Egyptian vegetarian diet. The meat was extremely pricey, and typically only royalty could afford it. In Egypt's arid climate, meat was also very hard to keep, so animals used for ritual slaughter had to be used up quickly. Even though self-indulgence was not appropriate at every gathering, festivals provided the ideal opportunity to indulge in any form of excess, including meat consumption for those who so desired. There were distinct characteristics associated with each commemoration or celebration. Death was not the end. One's death was seen as a transition from one phase to the next, because one's earthly life was only a part of an eternal journey. Every class of ancient Egyptians placed the utmost importance on having a proper burial. The deceased person's body was washed, wrapped in wrappings, known as mummification, and buried with the things they would want or require in the afterlife. Of course, the more money a person had, the more elaborate their tomb and the items associated with it would be. However, even the poorest individuals provided appropriate graves for their loved ones. Egyptians enjoyed a vivacious and exotic life. They were full of life, and they loved eating and drinking. The history of Egypt is so rich and distinguished that even modern people get amazed by the incredible civilization. If you're a history fanatic like us, don't forget to like and share this video with other history maniacs.